Hello there and good afternoon. Welcome once again to now becoming weekly Ukraine War Q&A sessions with Professor Michael Clarke. Professor Clarke, thank you very much for joining us as always, and thank you all for joining us live on YouTube and on our website. Thank you for submitting your questions for the past few hours. And remember, if you have any questions that you'd like Michael to answer as we're going along, submit them on our website or in the YouTube comments, and we'll try and get to them should we have time. I mean, it's not as if there's not loads to talk about today, Professor. Extraordinary moment. We've now seen drones flown into Poland, at least 19. I think 4 potentially shot down. You can tell us the very latest, Michael, as we understand it. Just tell us, first of all, what happened before we get into the questions. What happened overnight?
Overnight, as part of an attack, another big attack on Ukraine, which looks to have been about 420 drones and 30-odd missiles. Slightly more missiles this time in the mix than normal, but about 455 objects into Ukraine, of which at least 19 were tracked over Polish airspace. And looking at the tracks, and I was looking at this early this morning, these are the tracks that are, come up on social media. So these are not official governmental information, but it's the information from the community out there who spends all night doing these things. And a lot of the tracks, I mean, I counted at least 15 separate tracks over Polish territory. Wow. And some of them just disappeared into the north of Poland. Maybe the thing was shot down there, or maybe just went off the radars. But most of them went in a circle over the Lublin area of southern Poland and then back into Ukraine. The Poles say that they shot down at least 4. There's some arguments that they may have shot down 10. Okay. I'm not sure about that. We haven't found the debris of the 10 yet, although they might during the day. But certainly there were 19 tracked objects. And it is said that one piece of debris is of a missile, is what we're told. Now, we don't know what sort of missile, whether it was a cruise missile or a ballistic missile, which would be a lot more serious. But we'll find out, I'm sure, before the end of the day. As soon as the experts get to look at it, they'll tell you exactly.
We'll know, won't we? Very soon.
Yeah, exactly.
There'll be no needs to cover up what's happened.
No. We'll know by the end of the afternoon, I think. Wow. And the drones themselves, there's only one drone that we've got a photograph of. I said when I saw it, it looked like a Duran 2 to me. Sky Forensics has since been on to some experts. They said it's more likely to be a Jabera, which is a decoy made to look like a Duran 2 to fool people like me, obviously. So it looks in every respect like a Duran 2, but it's much cheaper to produce.
It doesn't have the munitions, it's just a decoy drone that goes up.
It's just a flying object that doesn't do the same things as a Duran 2, but it looks like it and appears like it on radar. It's very, very cheap. So it looks like a Jabera, a decoy drone that is one that the photographs that we're all looking at, landed in field in Poland. But I think others will turn up before the end of the day. So clearly it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't something that just went off course. At least 19 and maybe more drones and maybe a missile went over Polish airspace pretty deliberately. And the tracks I looked at went over Polish airspace, circled round in the area of Lublin, in that province of Poland, and then went back into Ukraine, presumably to whatever the target was.
Mike's got the first question here, and it's the why question, so I'm going to give you that in a second. But just on the track that you've seen, are those drones controlled by human operators, or is that an AI track that's given it that sort of that shape? Because again, I'm trying to work out the deliberate nature of this.
Good point. I mean, generally speaking, the Duran 2 is very manoeuvrable and can be manoeuvred while it's in flight. The Duran 1, which is basically the Shahed 136, which is the Iranian drone, which the Russians were using, and then they started producing them, an upgraded version themselves. The original Shahed drones, you just set them off.
Right, and they went to their target.
Yeah. They had a GPS tracker on them, and they went to their target if they got there. The more modern ones can be controlled in flight, and when we see what the balance was between these, however many it was that may have landed in Polish soil, we'll get a good look at that as to whether they were being controlled in flight or whether they were programmed to do that when they left their bases. But I'll also say that pretty clear they were all launched. All these 400 odd drones and missiles were launched from Western Russia. Right. You can see the launch sites all the way around the edge of Ukraine, in that northern part of Ukraine. 1 or 2 were launched from the Black Sea, which is normal. I mean, average is what they do. You don't need to think about those too much. They went off towards Odessa. But all these that we're looking at were launched from the western part of Russia. So they flew all the way over Ukraine, which is a very long way, and then went into Poland, then came back into Ukraine.
I think you made it quite clear that it can't be a mistake. That's quite a deliberate act.
It was pretty deliberate.
So let's get the question then from Mike. Why?
Well, we're guessing about this, of course, and the Russians have said it wasn't us. That's one of the more predictable statements of the morning, that the Russians would say, oh, it's nothing to do with us. It must have been Ukraine sending drones against its neighbour. Yeah, of course. So it was deliberate. What are they trying to tell us? I think two sorts of things. One is it's another warning to Western countries not to put troops into Ukraine as part of any peace arrangement that might or more likely not be concluded. So it's a way of ratcheting up pressure, because the Russians always say to anything the West says about we might do this, we might do that, the Russians say, well, you're risking war. And implicitly, of course, it might become a nuclear war. Every time the West takes a stand on some aspect of what's going on in Ukraine, the Russians say, well, you're risking war. And they use this phrase to frighten everybody into backing off. So it's partly a reinforcement of that. It's partly connected, I think, to the Zapad exercises, which which we'll talk about, I'm sure.
They start on the 12th, I believe.
Start in a couple of days' time.
Absolutely. Yep. Zapad again, which means west. Which
means west.
Before
Zapad
they did the last ones, they invaded Ukraine.
They did.
A couple of months afterwards.
They did. And so we can talk about that later on, but it's part of that pressure, which will be on Poland. The Zapad exercises are going to pressure Poland. It's part of that. But it's also, I think it's part of a longer-term project of the Russians, that on the assumption that the Ukrainian war will just go on for some time yet, the Russians, we know, are pushing up against Article 5. They're pushing up against NATO boundaries to see how much they can push them, to see if they're porous, to see if they really can, break down the boundaries. Because Article 5 is, as we've said before, it's actually full of wiggle room. But the way Article 5 has been interpreted in NATO since 1949 is that an attack on one is an attack on all, will be treated as an attack on all, and it does say that. And by implication, we will go to war if our collective boundary of 32 states is breached anywhere. That's the political import of Article 5. And the Russians
it says that about the boundary as well, does it?
Yeah, exactly. So the boundaries of NATO, which are now bigger than they were before the Ukraine invasion, because Sweden and Finland joined NATO, so they've got another big boundary there. So if any of those boundaries are penetrated by Russian force or anybody's force, then the rest of NATO will back up whoever's been attacked. And the Russians undoubtedly are going to try and push this Article 5 boundary to see if they can break it down or whether it's porous in some places. And I think they'll probably find that it is, because with the United States in its present mood, the US isn't going to react to a Russian incursion into NATO territory. It's very unlikely under present management. And so I think the Russians must feel, well, this is their opportunity to show that Article 5 doesn't mean very much. And what they want to show, they won't have any change out of the northern members of NATO, who are all pretty strong on their opposition to what Russia is doing. But the southern members of NATO, who are much more equivocal, if they think that Article 5 actually doesn't mean very much, or won't mean very much if it's pressured, then they will start to change their orientation and say, well, look, Russia's going to be a power in Europe. We've got to live with that. We've ought to bend towards what will accommodate Russian wishes and so on. And so that if the Russians can break down Article 5 in the next few years, they will certainly try. And we know that they're already going in every area, at sea, in air, in cyberspace, in maneuvers, in social media, in subversion, everything. They're going right up to the boundary of Article 5, right up to the boundary of physical violence over the border. Everything they can think of that is just below that threshold. And that's getting worse all the time.
And if they break Article 5, if they show that Article 5 does not have the resolution that's meant to, that's it for NATO, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, well, NATO then sort of fractures into, in my view, a northern part and a southern part. I mean, I think NATO is probably going that way anyway. 32 nations is an awfully big alliance to hold together. The northern 10 or 12, I think, will stick together probably more closely than ever before, because they just feel a common threat, and they have a common sort of objective as the northern free trading liberal democracies. That's not entirely true of some of the southern members of NATO, who might just think differently and feel that they've got different interests.
Quick question on your geography. You go north-south. Where would Turkey sit?
Turkey's a southern member.
Turkey would sit as a southern member.
The big question is France, because France is both a northern and a southern member. It's got an Atlantic coast and a Mediterranean coast. So is France a northern or a southern member of Europe? And of course, France is, we are France, we are Europe, which, of course, back in the 15th, 16th century, that was true. France was Europe, in effect. So a big question. And that's why the future of France as a world power is pretty important to how Europe evolves in terms of its security.
I won't get you to talk about, Jeff, one of my other favourite topics, because that's another grouping as well.
Expeditionary force, yeah.
Of northern nations, as northern European nations.
The northern 10, yeah. The northern 10, led by Britain. The whole thing, the joint expeditionary
I said I wasn't going to get you to talk about it, but you do it anyway.
All right, no.
There you go.
It was devised in 2010. It became a reality in sort of 2014, 2015. But it's a proper reality now, and it needs to be even more real. And that's the guts of a North European group of nations who are prepared to do more for their own defence.
I should know this. Are Poland in, Jeff?
Yeah, no, Poland is not in it. Should be.
Yeah.
Should be. There's some internal politics there because some of the Baltic states say, oh, Poland's so big and they dominate us. And they say, oh, look,
huge army.
Get over yourself. We need Poland in it. We need Canada in it. That's a northern state. And actually, Germany should back it up. And Germany, at some point in the future, might come into it. So, if you had Canada, Poland, and Germany in that other 10, you've really got the guts of a really powerful joint alliance within NATO. It's not going to undermine NATO. It's a sort of a super group inside NATO, using NATO procedures, NATO weapons, and so on. And if other nations wanted to be associated with it, well, fine.
Why not? Exactly, because of the strength that collective group will have, especially if NATO is fracturing. We're not seeing the protection that's needed.
It'd be a pillar of strength in the north. Yeah.
All right. Question here from Alex, because the Poles have triggered NATO Article 4. We're learning all about a NATO charter today, aren't we? What is the desired outcome of invoking it? First of all, what does Article 4 say?
Article 4,
and what's the desired outcome?
Any state can invoke Article 4, and I checked this up this morning. It's only been invoked 7 times. Since 1949. So in 75 years, this is only the 7th time it's been invoked. So it's on average once a decade. So it's not trivial. And Poland has invoked Article 4. And Article 4 says that the NATO powers will consult on when any member feels that either their territorial integrity, their security, or their democratic independence is at stake. And so that's it, territorial integrity, democratic independence, or security. And Poland has said on all 3 grounds we are invoking Article 4. And that means that NATO has to consult. And as we speak now, the defence ministers of Britain, France, Germany and Italy and Poland are meeting at the moment. And I think that will probably dissolve into wider meetings with the other 28-odd states. As the day goes on. Certainly there'll be a lot of communications online, I would imagine. So NATO today is invoking Article 4, and the last time it invoked Article 4 was just after the Russian invasion in 2022. So that's 2022, 2025, that's twice in a decade, which is more than has been the case in the past, average once in a decade.
It tells you something, doesn't it?
There we are. Yeah, tells us the sort of road we're on, sadly.
Question here from Adrian P., who declares himself to be a Polish national. Thank you for being with us, Adrian. Could the attack that we saw of those drones and missiles, be the result... the drones, be the result of the closure of the Polish-Belarusian border announced by the Polish government yesterday? I should actually just double-check on this. So Donald Tusk said that the Polish-Belarusian border would be closed because of the Zapad exercises.
Oh, so Zapad. Shall we talk about Zapad
Let's do
now?
Zapad.
Right. Yeah, so the Zapad exercises are not as big and threatening as people thought they might be.
There was a time when the North Koreans were going to be involved as well.
That's right.
We talked about that.
There's 20-odd states involved as observers, and there's a sort of company-level exercise. I'm interested to see that a company and 90-odd soldiers of India are going to be there.
Interesting.
I mean, there's not much you can do at company level. It's symbolic.
Yeah.
So it doesn't represent a lot. Now, it looks as if 13,000... mainly Belarusian troops are involved, but even the Belarusians seem to be bringing that number down a bit. We thought it might go up considerably to 25 or 30,000 and even be some sort of preparation for another northern offensive against Ukraine. I mean, that was something that the Ukrainians were worried about. That doesn't seem to be happening. There's no observed big troop build-up, and the Russians are not there in any big numbers. They're there, but they're not there in big numbers. What has happened with Zapad is that this was going to be held in the middle of Belarus, which is a big geographical country, but they've moved it to the Polish border. So all these exercises are going on the Polish border. Not surprisingly, Poland, Donald Tusk has announced that they're closing the border for the next few days. Yeah. So I think they'd be doing that anyway in light of the drone attack. And they're doing it because of the Zapad exercises. So I would expect the Belarusian-Polish border to remain closed for, I don't know, a week or two, maybe longer. And that will affect trade in the north. It'll hurt Belarus more than it hurts Poland, but it'll hurt both of them a little bit. But there you are. So there's a closed border. Does it make a big difference to the Ukrainian war strategically? Not really. We'll all be watching these Zapad exercises to see if there's anything in there that we haven't expected. But they look as if they're a political expression of all of the countries that the Russians can bring to watch them do these things.
Yeah.
And countries from the stands, and China are going to be there, and India is going to be there. Lots of other countries. Cuba is going to be there.
Interesting that they've downsized them. I mean, we were talking about them sort of quite regularly for the past few weeks, haven't we? And I've obviously had in the back of my mind quite a fear that they're going to be huge. But
under the Vienna Convention, which is one of the confidence-building measures that has gone west in recent years, but we used to inform each other of exercises above a certain level. So if you had troop numbers above a certain level, you had to inform everybody else, so many months in advance. And it looks as if the Belarusians are trying to stick to that. They're trying to keep the numbers below the level at which they will inform everyone. But they have informed other people of the numbers they expect. Now, it's still possible that they could pull a surprise and suddenly 20,000, 25,000 troops would turn up. But there's no sign of that.
Quick thought, was it similar in 2021 when they ran Zapad?
It was a big exercise then. It's bigger than this one.
Bigger than this one, okay.
Off the top of my head, I can't remember what the numbers were then, but they were big. Yeah,
right.
They were big.
So on the other side of this as well, the Poles and the Lithuanians have announced that they're running an exercise. They're calling it Brave Griffin, and it's about another one. I know one of your favourite topics is the Suwalki Gap.
Yes.
So let's take everyone through the Suwalki Gap and how important it is, and why the Poles and Lithuanians may well are exercising now to show their readiness to protect it.
The Suwalki Gap, if you look on a map, is this corridor between Belarus and Kaliningrad, which is Russian enclave inside Lithuania. So the Lithuania's got its country, and then a piece of the coast is Kaliningrad, the old Königsberg as it used to be, which is Russian territory. And of course, that's a Russian outpost. It was at the end of the Cold War, it was just a junkyard of old equipment. It was terribly polluted.
What's the history? Why did they get to keep Kaliningrad?
Well, it was in the old Soviet Union, of course.
Fine.
It was a very important shipyard. And port. And when the successor states deal was made, the Soviet Union collapsed, it was agreed that would remain because that was thoroughly Russian. It's a bit like Crimea.
Okay.
It was so Russian. It was agreed then in Kaliningrad that should be part of the future of the Russian Federation.
Interesting.
And as I say, it just seemed like an anomaly at the time because it was. I remember talking to people. They said, "Oh, it's terrible. It's full of old submarines and stuff, and it's leaking and awful." But I mean, the Russians have since modernised it and made it into quite a useful base. But it's a base that sits surrounded by NATO territory. And now that Sweden and Finland have joined the alliance, it sits on a sea that is NATO's. NATO has complete control over. I mean,
how do they supply it?
The Baltic is a NATO lake, really. Although the Russians hate that idea, but it is.
How do they get stuff in and out of it, Michael? If they can't not go through NATO territory,
generally speaking,
and they drive things through NATO territory.
Yeah, there was agreements which, and the Lithuanians and the other Baltic states, they're quite careful because the Russians can only send certain things in and out, and that was all pre-agreed. And if the Baltic states think that they're breaking the agreement, they can stop these convoys coming backwards and forwards, and that becomes a bit of an issue as well. Otherwise, they can supply it by sea from Petersburg.
Right.
But again, we're watching exactly what they do. And so this fear, this Suwalki Gap, was always the idea that, well, the Russians could push through from Belarus, they could push through to Kaliningrad and insulate or isolate the Baltic states so that NATO won't be able to reinforce them. And there'll be the three Baltic states be cut off by land and sea by Russian power. Well, that's no longer true, given that Sweden and Finland are now in the alliance. That really changed the geopolitical realities of Northern Europe when they joined in 2023. So now the Suwalki Gap is more a source of weakness to Kaliningrad, if anything. And what Poland and Lithuania are doing is, look, in the event of hostilities, we're going straight into the Suwalki Gap.
Right, we're defending
and you lose everything you've got in Kaliningrad.
Yeah.
Say goodbye to it. We can
can
blockade it by sea, we blockade it by land, we'll occupy the Suwalki Gap. Everything you put in Kaliningrad, you lose. And with that knowledge, the Russians won't put anything important in there.
Interesting.
That's the idea.
As we were talking before we started recording, that's about calling their bluff on things, isn't it? And having them ready.
Yeah.
And this readiness force, I mean, it's not a huge number of people that are involved in these exercises, but I imagine with the size of the Polish army and perhaps those Lithuanian forces that are close by, they could get
They think about it
numbers of
quite a
people
lot. I mean, as I say, what was a source of weakness is now something. Well, it's not a source of strength, but it's a geopolitical anomaly that could be snuffed out quite quickly.
Okay. Good question here from Jason Chambers. Thank you for this, Jason. It's come in just at the right point in our discussion, Michael, as well. What could be the outcome of Article 4, their discussions, invoking in this case? Would it be heightened security in the nation that invoked it?
Yeah, it'll be more of the same. I mean, Article 4 is just that any member of NATO can demand that NATO discuss their problem. And that's what's happened. This morning, Poland said, we want NATO officially to discuss our problem under Article 4. I mean, it would have happened anyway, but by declaring Article 4, they're increasing the sense of political importance of it, only the seventh time since the foundation of the alliance. So they're making it clear that this is very important to Warsaw. And what will come out of it? Well, more of the same. So it'll be the Allies saying, well, we'll tighten up our air defences, we'll be more prepared if necessary to operate across that border with Ukraine and Belarus. And maybe the alliance might end up declaring we will shoot down anything. If any, I mean, they might do that. They might say, look, we'll put enough air assets in place that if anything comes over any of the borders, we'll shoot it down automatically before we ask any questions. They might take a strong line like that.
Interesting.
And say we'll defend our airspace, regardless, rather than monitoring it and seeing what we do. At some point,
something
this
has
is
to be
probably
done.
what they've got to do. They've got to say, if you send things into our airspace, you lose them.
Well,
the Romanians, whoever's in them.
The Romanians scrambled some F-16s, I think, because they were concerned about their airspace.
They did, yeah. I mean, it's been happening regularly since this part of the Ukraine war started, that airspace has been violated in a number of cases. Moldova, who can't do anything about it. I mean, missiles and aircraft, or missiles certainly, and drones have been flying over Moldova, and they can't react one way or another. But it's been happening, and the NATO nations have been taking a sort of a careful look at it. They express their concern, they protest, they say we're monitoring and we'll keep on monitoring. Well, if these attacks or these incursions as that we saw last night, if this becomes regularized, I'm sure that's what the Kremlin would like to normalise this so that we start to not take it too seriously. But if NATO, I think, will say we will take this seriously, and if necessary, we'll be prepared to shoot down anything that comes over our airspace. That's what I'm guessing they might do.
Okay, let's move on to response. I think, Jack, that may answer your question as well as to whether or not we're going to see more attacks from Russia. I think it depends on the response from NATO nations as to whether or not the Russians decide they want to try and do this again. So question here from Donna on the response. At which point does NATO decide enough is enough and first strike Russia? What does it take? I mean, is that even in NATO doctrine to strike Russia first?
No. NATO's never had a first strike doctrine, except in nuclear issues. We, in the old days, in the Cold War, because NATO was conventionally so much weaker than the Soviet Union, we always had a potential first nuclear strike doctrine. We said, if the Warsaw Pact attacks us, and we can't hold it, which we probably won't be able to. A massive attack would, come sweeping across Western Europe, and the Warsaw Pact idea was to get to the Channel in 3 days, before NATO had time to think through its nuclear policy. And so NATO's policy was, if we are put in that situation, we reserve the right to use our nuclear weapons first.
Wow.
And that first use doctrine was very controversial, as you can imagine.
Oh, yes.
And Western politicians didn't talk about that too much to their own publics, but that's what it was. And that now is reversed, because since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia is now much weaker than NATO collectively. And the Russians have said that if you attack us, and we're never going to attack Russia as such. I mean, we might defend ourselves against Russia, but the Russians always said, if you attack us, we reserve the right to use nuclear weapons first, because we are conventionally inferior to you, which is true in terms of sheer numbers.
It tells you about the philosophy of these kind of decisions, doesn't it? And when one is in the weaker position, one will then ratchet further above to try and make sure that you can gain some sense of strength.
Dominance, as they say in the business.
There we go.
Terrible phrase. But Donna's question is a really good one, which is, and I've thought about this, or talked about it an awful lot. We know we're being faced by Russia in so many areas. So, cutting cables, cyber attacks, all the things that we mentioned before. Political subversion of our whole election processes, social media interventions, and then assassinations, sabotage, and everything they can think of, right up to the level of Article 5. If things get worse, and it looks as if at the moment as if they will get more challenging, certainly that's the phrase, challenging. If they get more challenging, Donna's question is a really good one. At what point does the West collectively, or Western Europe, forget the United States in this respect for now, but at what point does Western Europe collectively say, that's it, no further? And the issue upon which you dig your toes in will look like a relatively trivial issue compared to the danger of war that you're running.
Yeah.
And that's what these tactics are all about, salami tactics, slice a little bit at a time, a little bit and a little bit. And so that although cumulatively what you're doing, if you're in the Russian situation here, that you're actually making incursions into Western freedom of action all the time, making Western countries less and less secure, any given action doesn't look worth a war. And because the Russians keep threatening war, every time the West does something, the Russians say, well, this might be war, and by definition it might therefore be nuclear war. They use that all the time as the constant existential threat. And so Donna's question is a very good one. At what point might Western countries say, that's it, we will not tolerate anymore? I mean, politicians will keep saying
Speculate for us, Michael. Come on, you're the man that knows. What point is there? At the point of apart from some kind of strike on the capital.
Well, what I think is most likely is something at sea. I think it to be something in the Baltic or in the North Atlantic, which is where the Royal Navy might find itself on the front line. That there'll be some issue at sea, either cable cutting or submarine incursions or something like that, or quite likely we start to seize dark fleet tankers, these illicit tankers that we've talked about
carrying oil and gas,
carrying oil illegally to Russia's customers, and that instead of just tracking them, even tracking them with a Russian warship, riding shotgun with them, which has happened when they've gone through the channel, they've got a Russian ship riding shotgun, and that we take them and we say, we hold off the Russian ship and we take the tanker and we drag it into port. And then we send the crew home, and then we start a legal process as to who it really belongs to, because it's uninsured, it shouldn't be there, it's had its transponders turned off, it's acting illegally, and it can, it can sit outside a port in Europe for the next 10 years, rusting away while we argue about it.
So we steal their ships, and
we take the ships on the assumption that they're behaving illegally. Now, my guess is and we're quite close to that. I mean, Finland's already done that in case of one ship. But I think we'll start doing it, we might start doing it with quite a few more. And if we did, that would create an incident at sea of some sort. And I think that's, if you say to me, where might we dig our toes in, it would be something in the maritime sphere, I think, rather than the land sphere. Because I could see the way it might build up.
We take a ship, they then respond against one of our destroyers.
And then we live with and then we respond to the response. Yeah. I mean, I'm not advocating. Well, in a way, I'm advocating this. I mean, I'm advocating that we are more muscular against the shadow fleet.
Yeah.
But I think there's no alternatives which don't involve more risk. But doing nothing involves even more risk. That's the problem.
War has been joined in many ways, hasn't it, Michael? Yeah. And you have to respond to it in a certain way.
I hate to say this, Kamali, and I say this privately, but I mean, we're on the road to war. Doesn't mean to say that there's going to be a war. But the road we are on, and that they are on, is confrontational. We're moving towards a military confrontation. Now, I hope we don't get there, but that's the course that we're all on at the moment. And it's not of our choice.
No.
It's been created by the way Russia's reacted to what we've done. And we could have handled our diplomacy differently over the last 15 years. We've been clumsy in some respects, but we've not been malicious. That's the point. The Western world has not acted maliciously. It may have acted foolishly and clumsily and hastily in some respects, not all, by any means.
What, expanding NATO that way?
Yeah, letting NATO enlarge. Again, NATO didn't want to enlarge, but everybody wanted to come into it. Everybody wanted to join the club.
It's weird that the ones that came in later as well, people like Hungary and Slovakia, they're probably not the most reliable of NATO members now, are they?
And that's the point. I mean,
right? Isn't that ironic?
Poland was the one that made a difference to NATO, because it's a big country with big forces, and they're very reliable partners, and that goes back a long way. Some of the other southern European states, they bring more commitments than they bring advantages, and they extend NATO's boundary, which is, so we've got more boundary to defend, more things to worry about. But the idea was, when these countries were so desperate to come into NATO, NATO felt, well, you can't keep them out as if somehow we're all safe in the castle and everybody else can sit out there.
That was the feeling, wasn't it?
It was a kind of an ideological sense that these countries deserve to come into the family of democratic nations. And the reason that they all wanted to come into NATO, the fundamental reason, was to get American protection. And lo and behold, they're now in NATO, and American protection is disappearing.
He's closed his umbrella, hasn't he? All right, let's crack on. Question here from Simons. When are NATO and the EU and the coalition of the willing going to put up a no-fly zone in Ukraine?
It's feasible. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but a no-fly zone over Ukraine would make some difference. In other words, if it said it's a way of deterring regular Russian air attacks on Ukrainian cities. That's plausible, but it would only work again if the United States was prepared to back it up, not with combat aircraft, but with some of the facilitators and some of the intelligence and target acquisition material, and some of their electronic surveillance aircraft. So in other words, American aircraft might have to be in the air, not necessarily over Ukraine, but in the air in support of European aircraft that might be in the air over Ukraine. It's not, again, it would, I don't think it's likely to happen given the way things are moving, but it's plausible if the Europeans are going to take half a step into helping the Ukrainians fight the war more directly than just supplying them.
Just a little sidebar on that. When we think of no-fly zones, we think of previous iterations of this sort of thing that NATO put in, over Iraq,
famous
over Iraq,
northern no-fly zone, the southern no-fly zone,
and during the Yugoslav,
after the 1991 war,
and after the Yugoslav war as well, were there no-fly zones over Sarajevo and stuff? Did we put one?
There were for a short time.
We tried to put that in.
Yeah. That didn't matter too much because nobody had much of an air force.
Right. Well, this is the crux of my question here. We're in a different technological space as well. Russia has a huge air force too. What would a no-fly zone actually consist of? What would it actually look like? It wouldn't be like those previous ones, would it? This is a whole new iteration of it.
It would be different. So it would be a much more ground-based air defence. So in other words, our air defence assets inside Ukraine, probably towards the west, so they're a bit safer, being prepared to fire at any Russian drones or missiles.
Right.
Plus
that's
Western aircraft.
Missile.
Sorry?
Surface-to-air missile sites.
Surface-to-air missiles, yeah. So ground-based. GBAD is called ground-based air defence. So it'd be that, plus Western aircraft patrolling the skies of Ukraine, prepared to take on drones or, if necessary, missiles, or Russian aircraft if they strayed into Ukrainian space. That would be the implication of it. That might not be such a problem because not many Russian aircraft do stray into Ukrainian space now.
They stand for these, fire that glide bomb from distance.
I mean, they are in terms of the tactical battle on the ground. There's Russian aircraft being used, and so there'd be an issue there. But in terms of these nightly bombardments, most of those are Russian aircraft inside Russian airspace releasing, KH-101 cruise missiles or something like that.
And an aircraft, an F-35, F-16, could shoot down a cruise missile. Could it shoot down a hypersonic missile?
No, they can shoot down cruise missiles of most sorts.
Could it shoot down a ballistic missile?
Probably not. Only if they're lucky in the right place at the right time. Right. Ballistic missiles can only really be shot down by Patriots, the ground-based Patriot batteries. There's one or two others that could catch a ballistic missile, depending on what you're talking about. But there's almost no defence at the moment against hypersonic missiles because these things are, Mach 8, Mach 9, Mach 10, some of them.
Wow.
And Mach 8 is 6,000 miles an hour. And they descend so quickly that you can't get a bead on them quickly enough, even a very sophisticated system.
Nerdy question. Are they parabolic or do they fire?
They're both.
Even worse.
Yeah. So some of the hypersonic missiles are just like cruise missiles, but they're able to go very, very fast at the end of their flight, and they can jump up, as it were, and then drop down really quickly. Right. Others are ballistic missiles, which are just fast all the way. And the most modern hypersonic missiles can maneuver before they fall. So they can be on a track, you're tracking it, and then it changes track and then comes very, very fast down to its target.
Incredible.
They're not impossible to defend against, but very difficult, and you've got to have real top-of-the-range stuff. And again, if the other side has got enough hypersonic missiles, as, say, the Chinese will have in 10 or 20 years' time, you can't put enough air defense against them to stop some getting through.
Okay, you moved us on to a question then about China. We're going to think back to that meeting in Beijing. Jonathan Hodge asks, do you think it's possible Russia, China, North Korea secretly made a pact giving Russia more freedom to antagonise NATO?
I don't know about a secret pact. I think there's an implicit understanding that antagonising NATO is good for North Korea and for China, and they're happy to see Russia do that. And the Russians certainly want to, I'm not sure they want to, well, they do want to antagonise NATO, but what Russia wants is to weaken NATO fundamentally. And the best way of weakening NATO is to split America away from the European allies. And that's, the moment the Americans are giving that to them on a plate, walking away effectively from NATO, that may not last forever, but that's where we are at the moment. So, I mean, what the Russians have always wanted is to divorce United States security from European security, and then Russia's size gives it a lot of influence over any one European state. So it's much harder for the Europeans, unless they're much more united than they have usually been without American leadership. If the Europeans are prepared to take it up, then they should be able to outface Russia and not be subject to Russian blackmail. But the Russians have always had that sense that if only they could get the United States out of European security, they could deal separately with Germany, separately with Britain, separately with France, and they get their way. They get what they want. So, is there a pact to do it? I doubt that there has to be. There's an understanding that for China and North Korea, anything that weakens NATO is, by definition, good for them.
It's good for them, isn't it? Exactly. Yes. That tacit agreement. They don't have to write it down at all. They all know what they're working towards. A question here about Russia striking... we didn't even talk about this, really. Striking government buildings.
Yeah.
Just last week. Question from RZ, does this show that the Kremlin is getting angry over Ukraine striking all refineries? The Ukrainians have been doing that in quite some number. And what else could these latest strikes reveal about Putin's approach?
That's a good question. I think, there is an element of anger in Russia's strikes, but the anger is taken out on these really big numbers, sort of 700 and 800 drones and missiles a night across a whole range of targets. Striking a government building, I don't think it's anger so much as an expression that it's a signal that the Russians are prepared to go as high as us. We will escalate and keep escalating. If you don't give in, then we'll just keep on going, and we can do more. There is some certainly rumours. There's evidence through rumour. I wouldn't put it any more than that at the moment. That the Russians have reached out to the Ukrainians and have said, if you lay off our oil refineries, we'll lay off your infrastructure attacks. We'll go easy on infrastructure if you stop attacking our refineries. I can't confirm that, but I can confirm that some people think that conversation has been taking place through Turkey. And it was through Turkish intermediaries because they didn't want it to go through the United States.
Around about this time last year and probably the year before, Russia was starting to hit Ukraine's energy infrastructure, wasn't it? Trying to freeze them through the winter, which they did hit them, but they didn't ever manage to keep the lights off entirely.
They didn't.
So one wonders if there's
I've been doing some stuff on this recently in anticipation of the winter. The Russian attacks over the last few months, they started earlier, and the attacks that we've seen until about 2 weeks ago were on energy infrastructure. So they're trying to dismantle the infrastructure, transport and rail links that were necessary for the power plants for Ukraine. And now they've gone over to generating capacity. So Ukrainian power generating capacity. So they're trying to give the Ukrainians an even worse winter than they had so far, and they probably can. The one thing they haven't done is go for the nuclear plants. Now, Ukraine's got 4 nuclear plants, the biggest of which is Zaporizhzhia, of course. Biggest in Europe, and that's closed, so that's off the grid. But they've got 3 other nuclear plants which are still providing intermittently about 50% of their power. And the Russians are not going for those plants because going for nuclear plants would be inherently more dangerous to everybody.
You couldn't do it,
and would attract much more international.
You couldn't strike a nuclear plant with a missile.
Well, they're not doing it. They're not. But anything you do to a nuclear plant could be really very dangerous. So the Ukrainians have been relying on those 3 nuclear plants to operate as high as they can, as powerfully as they can, and they're getting something like up to 50% of the power that they need. But they're going to lose most of the rest of the system. And if the Russians can interfere with the grid by which those nuclear plants transmit their power, then even if the nuclear plants stay in process, if they stay working, the Russians have worked on taking down the infrastructure that allows that power to be transferred. So the Russians are really very determined to go after the power sources of Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainians have had some success, real success, in going after Russian refining capacity. And so they've hit something between 10 and 20%. The Americans say 20%. Figures I've seen are lower than that. But nevertheless, Russian refining capacity for producing petrol and some diesel is now significantly affected.
And when they've hit a fifth of it, does that mean that a fifth of it is out of action, can't be used?
Yeah, I mean, and it's taken longer to repair. And the Ukrainians, too, have gone both for the refineries and for some of the infrastructure that supports the refineries. And some of those refineries are very difficult to get up and running again once they've been hit, because they burn for
I was going to say they catch fire, don't they?
Yeah, they catch fire, and they burn for 3 or 4 days, and they do a lot of ancillary damage. So the Ukrainians feel as if they're having some success with the refineries, but as people have asked us before, will it have an effect on the front line of the battlefield? Well, not directly, but it does affect the Russian economy. And so petrol is going short, not particularly short, but short. Prices are rising. And we've said this before. I mean, I think we looked at this last week, didn't we? That wholesale prices have risen by more than 50% since the beginning of the year. Retail prices have gone up by more than 10%. But they will keep on going up if the Ukrainians keep on hitting the refineries. So the Russians are interested in some sort of partial truce on energy, on hitting each other's energy stores.
Interesting.
But the Ukrainians are suffering a lot more from what's being hit by the Russians than the Russians are suffering by what's being hit by the Ukrainians.
One to keep a close eye on as we get into winter. Let's finish then on this question from Adrian in the Netherlands. Thanks for this, Adrian. And it's general about the war in general, Michael. Okay. Is Russia building up a force in the Donbass near Pokrovsk, and will we see an autumn offensive? Adrian asks, I think rightly, isn't it too late in the time of year for that? And what about Ukraine's defensive line? We talked a lot about that fortress belt, didn't we, a couple of weeks ago? It's still obviously being pressed against, but it doesn't seem as if it's on the verge of falling. And now we're going into winter. The fighting season is coming to a close.
Yeah, another month, 5 weeks, and then things will change. Doesn't mean to say that fighting stops, but it's much harder for the offensive to carry on when the weather turns, first of all, wet and then cold and freezing, and then wet again in the spring before things start to dry out. But Adrian's is a very good question. I mean, one thing is clear, that the Russians seem to have transferred some of their Marines to the Pokrovsk direction, and they're good forces. They're naval infantry, are some of the best forces. So again, they've brought some of them around. They had them around Sumy when they were trying to break through into Sumy area. That's gone wrong. I mean, the Russian offensive, generally speaking, has stalled all the way around the front. This last month, they've made almost no gains. They claim all sorts of things which haven't been verified and don't seem to be true. But they're transferring some of the best forces around to Pokrovsk. So it's possible that they might be able to take Pokrovsk. I mean, we thought about a month ago that Pokrovsk was about to fall, and I was getting information from Ukraine that they were getting ready to leave it because they're surrounded to the north and the south of Pokrovsk. There's only one line open to the west, but that line is still open, and that's their get out. I mean, at some point they'll get out before they get completely surrounded. You would assume. So they might lose Pokrovsk, but the rest of the Donbass front isn't moving much. And the Russians are up in Lyman in the north. They're pushing hard from Lyman towards Slavyansk. They're pushing hard, but they're not making much progress because the fortresses, starting in the north, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, are really very strong. Even though the Russians are not far away geographically, they're a long way away in terms of taking it. If you look at the defences they've got to get through, something else is happening. And it's clear that the Ukrainians have been attacking Russian air defence assets in Kherson, down in the southwest, and in Crimea. And they're taking down a lot of Russian air defense assets in Crimea. Now, you only normally do that if you want to then go through the gaps that you've created. Yeah. And in the last 2 weeks, I've been watching a lot of attacks on Russian air defense. The Ukrainians aren't saying too much about this, and I'm just watching it to see if something else may happen. I wouldn't be surprised.
What's going on in your mind? Excuse me. My apologies. Should have had that in silence.
I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not predicting this. I'm just saying that it is possible that the Ukrainians might try some sort of surprise move before the winter, and the Russians might,
like they did with the Kursk incursion.
A bit like the Kursk incursion.
Distract.
I mean, if the Ukrainians could put pressure on Crimea, we've always said this. If the Ukrainians can make Crimea feel really insecure, then they score a strategic victory, which will make Putin think about the costs of the war and what he might lose if the pendulum begins to swing against him, which the Ukrainians, if they have to keep fighting, if they're prepared to, will feel, well, next year we can put the Russians under some pressure. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but I could see that that's the way a lot of people in Kiev now seem to be thinking.
Well, you can see the thought behind it. If you can't take back the entirety of your territory, if you can hurt your enemy in one particular spot,
give them something to worry about, right? Make them worry about something.
I think I said that was last question, but I'm going to give one more question here from Vlad, who's sent us a question on YouTube. Thank you for this, Vlad. It's back to where we were at the beginning, Michael. How worried, Vlad asked, should the Balkan nations be about the drone incursion into Poland and also just the war continuing in general?
Does he mean the Balkan nations or the Baltic nations?
He said the text here is Balkan. I don't know.
Vlad, I'm guessing that you mean Baltic. I'm guessing. I don't know.
Can you do both? I mean, would the Balkan nations have any concern?
Well, all the nations. Yeah. I mean, the Baltic states are the ones that feel under most threat. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the three Baltic states. But you'd also say, well, Finland, who's got a long border with Russia, and Poland. I mean, those are the ones that worry the most, and Denmark as well. For the West, but the Danes also think a lot about Russian incursions of various sorts. So those are the Baltic states that will feel that the Russians are crossing a line with these deliberate drone attacks into Poland. The Balkan nations, I mean, the NATO nations, you're talking about Romania, Bulgaria, not really the Czech Republic, but then you're talking about Montenegro, who is a NATO member, the might of Montenegro. They were the 30th. They were the 30th new member of NATO, the Montenegrins.
An extra step.
And Slovenia is. But I mean, to be honest, their concerns are much more Mediterranean security.
Right.
And they worry much more about what's happening between Greece and Turkey, what's happening with immigration across the Mediterranean. It's not that they don't take a view on Russian policy, but they don't feel as if they're in the front line. And by extension, you go from the Baltic nations, the Balkan nations, to the Iberian nations. Look at Poland, at Portugal and Spain.
Yep.
And they don't want to do anything.
They
just feel as if they are so far away that anything they do is purely as a political support.
I think the Spanish did send some patriots early on in the war. I think there was some.
They've not been complete. They've not been unhelpful. But there's no question about it. When it comes to things like the so-called reassurance force, the coalition of the willing, the Spanish have said, "Look, we're out. Why would you expect us to do anything?"
I wonder if, from Vlad's question though, there is perhaps a weakness there to test this, as you say, this pushing up against the Article 5. You're testing someone like Montenegro or wherever else in that particular part of the world, whether the NATO nations would be willing. We know what's happening up in the north around Poland and Lithuania. That other part of the world is interesting.
Moldova is due for elections in 2 weeks' time, and the Russians are said to be interfering in them in a very big way. And Maya Sandu, the Prime Minister of Moldova, who is a very brave person, I think, is fighting hard to maintain some integrity in Moldova. If the Russians take over Moldova, if either by an internal subversion or by finding a way to walk in, which they would have done if they'd taken Odessa in Ukraine, Moldova is right next to Romania. I mean, Moldova is the old, what used to be, Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, all these areas of the old 19th century map. But the absorption of Moldova into the Russian sphere would put immediate pressure on Romania. Because Moldova feels effectively very, very Romanian, its history, its culture, language, and so on. And that would be a way in which what we're seeing in Russian policy would affect the Balkan states.
Then you're up into the Balkans. Professor Clarke, thank you as always, and thank you all for your questions. I was slightly deceptive at the beginning of this. So this is going to be we're going to take a pause next week because the state visit's happening. President Trump is in town, so we're going to take a week off, but we will endeavour to be back with you the week after next for more of Professor Clarke's brilliance as he explains to us what's going on in this crazy world in which we all inhabit. All right, thanks for being with us, and we'll see you again very soon.